Hey, I want to talk a little bit about working with cycles on the occult discipleship path, particularly through the lens of the rays. I think this is kind of useful, and I've always go through rounds of comprehending this at a new level. This is a beautiful thing about metaphysics when you're really working with right natural law principles, right? Is that you go, oh yeah, I get it, yeah, okay, and then you go through a round of those principles or truths not being alive in the reality, and you're running up against and then something drops and you work it out and you go, oh, there it is. And so there's that embodiment of these higher principles where they become no longer principles but a real intimate merging with natural law principles in action as genuine evolutionary processes, something like that. Okay, so let's talk about that. Keep watching. So we start at the beginning. Let's talk about the first ray. So this is a ray of will and purpose. And that, keep purpose in front of mind as we talk about the first ray. First ray energy is difficult to work with, and it's sort of a ray energy that we don't really respond to properly until a certain point on the path of reacting with the soul. It's actually a ray of synthesis, and this is where the purpose thing comes into play. Typically, when we think of synthesis, we bring the second ray into the picture, because that is a ray, well, just of synthesizing thing. It's wisdom, love, right? So bringing things together. Healing is on the second ray. Understanding, comprehension, consciousness. Consciousness synthesizes. When we're aware of something, this contextualizes. We understand things. We can see things clearly. When we understand the truth, we can then lead, make better action steps moving into the third ray. So yes, the second ray is synthetic in that general way. How is the first ray synthetic? And maybe fusion is a better word, but it's something like when we start working with will, and let's think of Vulcan, right? Because Vulcan is the first ray planet. Vulcan starts responding, people don't respond to Vulcan until a certain point of working with the soul, right? And then we've got the connection to Taurus there. And it's connected to the crown center. It is the higher purpose that comes from the soul. Vulcan hammers matter into the shape that it wants, that the God wants basically to serve the divine purpose. So this is the way in which it's synthetic in terms of the hammering component. So I'm making matter into what I want to make it into to reflect the divine. That's Taurus there, Vulcan and Venus and the connection there. So in the way in which it's practically, we can see it being synthetic in a practical way. It's something like when we connect to Vulcan, we're connected to the soul and the sense of an overriding purpose in the life, and we bend matter, the hammerer, to conform to that will. So there's a slightly, from a psychological angle, it can feel a bit like, oh, you know, and the mythology of Vulcan, he's quite grotesque and forceful and intense, and from a psychological angle, it's almost like maybe a bit rapey or something. But we have to distinguish between will and force. So force is really that response from the personality, and force as it translates into desire or something like that. That's the Taurian problem that we've elaborated on elsewhere, but it's that need to, and it's about me making things to assert my will. But of course, the higher level of will is thy will be done, right? Not mine. So there's a sacrificial component to working with will. Okay, so the first ray is synthetic in that way in terms of connecting to the life purpose. The challenge, though, in terms of making this lived in a practical and sustainable way in terms of our everyday human life is really found, the wisdom of that is found in the second and third rays. Because let's, for instance, say I can know what my purpose is as a soul. I'm to my Gemini rising, my Taurus sun, and I know where it's going. But is every action in my day-to-day life geared towards nothing but that? No, of course not. I have to eat, I have to sleep. There are things I have to tend to, right? And so there's an obviousness when you say that, but inside of myself while I was working this out, it was confusing to me because I was trying to really work out the Taurian problem and why Taurus rules the world disciple, right? Because it's all about the configuring of your life and the form, the hierarchy of what are the things and how do they relate to one another, and we've got to artistically like perfect the life expression and stuff like this. So this was a strong push and pull, the struggle of Taurus, that fourth ray process for myself. Like, okay, where does this part of myself come into being? So do I have to kind of transmute that into a divine thing, or do I have to include that in some way? So these things aren't always obvious. So here we have the second ray come into play, where it's something like bringing patience or an attitude of love towards the personality, and with that patience piece in the second ray, the time that it takes to bring things into order and to synthesis, allowing for the reality of our human needs when they're assuming that they're in a proper balance. Okay, like with the food thing, if you have an excessive addiction to food, then there's a problem. But in terms of the need for daily connection, for food, the basic physical needs, for a sense of grounded presence in our lives and everyday reality. And this is where, let's say, psychology comes into play, right? And bringing the personality into synthesis. And to whatever degree that is sort of a third ray thing, remembering that of the three primary rays, the four other rays after the third ray are attributes or aspects of the third ray. So the fourth ray, 4, 5, 6, 7, all angles of the third ray to some extent. So this thing of synthesis and moving in the life and having to make things practical as well. So, okay, what does that look like? So you can know what your goal is. You can know, assuming that you've connected to the intuition, you can have a sense of overall purpose in the life, but you have to be grounding that seeing into acknowledging what the daily needs are, looking at your real life in terms of what's immediately in front of you, coming off the back of the other discussion we had on, bearing the cross and seeing the soul's tests in everyday life. So to some extent, that's a second ray process of all inclusion. See, with the first ray, it's nothing but the purpose. And you do have to hold that at some higher level, but these are the upper planes, right? So it's like bringing all these planes of reality together, because you don't necessarily live every step of your day-to-day life like that. Okay, it's much more, there's other things going on. So it's something like you hold that first ray as that beacon, as the sun or something, but then you have to make sure these other dimensions of life are filled out. So all inclusion is a second ray aspect, and the soul in its generic angle, monad soul personality, is second ray. So the soul is always inclusive. It's always loving, healing, and synthesizing in the true second ray sense of the word in its intention. So I find for myself, when I get into a Taurian struggle, it can be something like, I need to move with my purpose, but this is like my personality reacting and trying to control and move into a forceful attitude relative to my body and to my life. And that's just impractical. And it actually creates a lot of psychic distress and noise from the angle of the personality, which means ultimately that the personality is corrupting the intention and the will of the soul. So for myself, when I've been able to drop that struggle, I've got Mars in Taurus too, which is like really just a bastard of a placement to overcome. Okay, esoterically considered, it's the warlike thing. It's like Mars taking on the will of Vulcan, and rather than just like, shut the fuck up, Mars. Nothing's, just chill out. There's no problem. Calm down. As if you can do anything productive from that angle anyway, because you can't. So for myself, when there was a surrendering of that sense of struggle, then there was more of that space, and then I could go, okay, can I connect to my higher purpose right now? And sometimes I can, for myself, I can hold the awareness of that light in the head, hold the head steady in the light, as the Tibetan says, but that doesn't always mean I'm getting direct communications and messages in that mercurial way. And so for a while I was like, why am I not personality reacting? Rather than having, this is the arrogance thing of Taurus, by the way, headstrong. Rather than dropping that attitude and going, well, maybe I'm not meant to receive any definitive steps right now. Maybe I already know what I need to do. And so with that in mind, okay, I've got a good motion with things happening on my channel here, and there's momentum going in that creative direction, and I can see roughly the next steps that need to be taken. So what then can I do? Well, I attend and apply loving care to those steps that are immediately in front of me in the mundane, everyday reality of daily life. Second ray, all inclusion, an attitude of consciousness, and including everything about the life, and then those practical daily human steps in terms of being in matter and substance and having a personality and all of the things that come along with that. Third ray. So that could mean that the best flow of my energy for that day is something like the mundane stuff, cleaning out the closet, going for a walk. And what I have found as I've been able to just master, I mean, this is simple stuff really, it's common sense when you say it, but necessarily sometimes these things come into struggle because you're bringing consciousness to them and you're trying to work out how things are related and all of this. So when I could find these points of cessation, drop that struggle with Mars, and just go, okay, well, I'm not really called to do anything epically, ultimately aligned with the purpose right in this moment. Just go do something chill. And then it would be like tidying or going for a walk. And then just find in that all-inclusiveness, now nothing separate from everything else. So yes, there's this purpose, but my everyday mundane actions aren't being excluded as irrelevant or less than or something like that. And then out on the walk, I get this inspiration, or I think about a concept in a new way that I haven't thought of before. And so this is that bringing in the mother principle or the substance principle, where you rest into psychic relaxation, and in that it creates that inner spaciousness of the psyche. It's a Cancerian theme too, right? Because we're finishing up in Cancer. If you've been following me on Instagram, I've written a few posts about Cancer. It's been a very enlightening month of Cancerian reflections. But Cancer is where we build the home, right? The home of the form. Cancer is said to be the strongest embodiment of the third ray principle at this iteration of evolution in our system, or something like that. So the nourishment, the space in astrology, the fourth house and those Cancerian themes can be reflective of that. It's the crab, it's going inward and being quiet and contemplative. And the Libra is a bit like that too, but it's particularly in this resting in and down into the mother principle, and welcoming and nourishing the human piece of that. So first ray, will, purpose, connecting to that. Second ray, all inclusion, consciousness, an attitude of love and investigation towards the life, in terms of just having that general openness to inquiry and to try and understand what's going on, contextualizing. And then those everyday habits, self-care practices, and this is sort of a feminine thing psychologically too. Cancer, Virgo, Moon, self-care, nourishment, healing, synthesis, relaxation, all of these things that come into to be a part of it, a part of this psychic balancing, and allowing this to be nourishing and multi-dimensional, and to try our best to maintain that kind of flexibility. I think as Westerners we can have a hard time with that because of our legacy with the overactive masculine component, at least psychologically, and that single-pointedness. Occultly we do have to be single-pointed, but being occultly single-pointed isn't the same as the personality being like this all the time. Okay, you could just be sitting as I'm sitting right now. I'm still single-pointed because I'm connected to my intuition or something like that, right? So it's about the inner quality and being able to relax into everything being part of the one being, something like that. My husband's really good at this. He is just able to go with his feelings, much more intuitive in the human way. In that sense, he just goes and chops the wood when he feels like it, and he hasn't got that propensity to make that separation between these different components. It's quite something. So the first ray thing, for some of you, that's not even going to be too relevant, because first ray energy, as I said, takes a while to come in to the picture, and it's not always... for most people, the opening to the soul begins more as a second ray impulse, with a will component too, in terms of the sacrificial element. It's difficult though, because that can be a Marsian, Neptunian sacrifice, but there can be a degree of potency in it. But it's an attitude of coming into all inclusion, of reorienting consciousness and choosing to start to become conscious about your life and live life in consciousness. And then the will component comes in a bit later, in terms of, this is what I meant to do. So the upper centers here, So it's like clarity, pure reason, heart synthesis, an attitude of all inclusion, consciousness, and then as we go down into substance and the vital energies of the lower centers in particular, bringing in the feminine component of this is what I got to do, the basic everyday daily grind of these different activities, and how can I come into a harmonic relationship with these things if I can understand the right relationship between these things. So that's first, second, third ray in essence in terms of a potential process. And I find at any particular point, one morning I might wake up and there's a big surge of willful energy, and then in terms of the synthetic or the fusing component of the first ray quality of purpose that I spoke of in the beginning, then that day there's just a lot of activity towards that. And so it sort of swings the second, third ray, particularly the third ray personality matter, those the activities into alignment with that action as a do. But not every day is like that necessarily, because there's other things that have to be done, and we have to be synthesizing things across the board. And with the second ray awareness of patience, and with the third ray awareness of cycles and natural intelligence, natural processes, there is a certain cleverness and if you're a strong first ray person, you want to get it done, you want to do it now and nothing else matters. But sometimes, again, when that becomes the personality angle of force that gets in the way, whereas being in a quiet, peaceful contemplation and perhaps being in a state of non-doing, reflective, loving consciousness meditation, second ray, or just some daily third ray activity, basic care practices. It's not obviously in alignment with the will or the purpose in that particular instance, but then as you complete that task or engage in that reflective meditation, then all of a sudden something lands, and that might be exactly the next key which reveals something to do with the purpose. So it's not always about that. For those of you that are a little bit more willful in temperament, which won't be all of you, of course, but that's something to keep in mind too, especially if any of you are responding to or are responding to the will component and are maybe trying to work that out. Perhaps this is just more of a message to myself, because I have very much struggled with this with Mars in Taurus, and my personality can definitely get a bit like, the soul! It's like, shut up. Just calm the fuck down and eat a sandwich. My God, woman. Anyway, that's my ramble for today. But I hope that made sense. And just start at least thinking about the key words perhaps are like the flexibility and the multidimensionality of being, and trusting a little bit more the nature of the flow of the process of consciousness as it's this evolutionary process working its way out through you, something like that, as well as that piece of the polarization into the soul and that occult kind of meditation. But it's this two prongs of occult dynamism with the dynamic tension that comes with that process, and the mystical way of just the being, the all-inclusion, balancing those opposites, all that kind of stuff. Flexibility, multidimensionality, and an attitude of all-inclusion, and seeing a little bit of the magic of day-to-day simple actions, a little bit of that Cancerian quality there. Okay, I think that's all for now. Thanks for listening.